You think large systems distribute control. They don't. The larger the system becomes, the narrower control gets. Everything eventually compresses into narrow points of dependency. You think scale distributes control. It doesn't. Scale concentrates it. This is ACHRONIC, a long-form documentary series about power, geography, and time. Not events, not heroes, not chronology, structures that outlast empires. ACHRONIC large systems appear expansive, connected, distributed, flexible. But over time, their movement compresses into fewer and fewer critical paths. Not because systems plan it that way, because coordination requires compression. The more complex the system becomes, the more movement depends on specific corridors, specific nodes, specific alignments. This creates the illusion of distributed control. But large systems do not remain distributed for long. Movement becomes directional, coordination becomes concentrated, and dependency begins narrowing around fewer and fewer paths. Once dependency narrows, control narrows with it. This is why scale creates bottlenecks, not accidentally. Structurally, every large system eventually depends on points it cannot afford to lose. Points where movement concentrates, pressure concentrates, coordination concentrates. The larger the structure becomes, the more critical those points become. At first, compression feels efficient, because concentrated movement increases speed. Movement becomes predictable. Coordination becomes faster. Flow becomes easier to organize. But efficiency creates fragility, because concentrated systems lose redundancy. Alternative paths weaken. Secondary routes disappear. Peripheral movement loses relevance. Over time, the system stops functioning as a distributed structure. It becomes directional. Everything starts depending on fewer connections, and fewer connections create higher structural pressure. This is why bottlenecks become inevitable inside expanding systems. Because systems optimize toward concentration, not openness. Distributed movement is difficult to coordinate. Compressed movement is easier to control. But compression changes the structure itself. It increases dependency. The system becomes faster but less resilient, more efficient but more exposed. At that stage, the system usually still appears stable. The infrastructure remains visible. Movement continues. Flow continues. Coordination continues. But internally, pressure has already become uneven, because concentrated systems amplify disruption. Small interruptions begin producing disproportionate consequences, not because the interruption is large, because the structure became narrow. This is the hidden instability inside large systems. The larger the structure becomes, the fewer paths it can actually depend on. This is why expanding systems eventually begin collapsing inward, not outward. Their visible scale remains enormous, but structurally, their movement becomes increasingly compressed underneath it. This is where perception fails, because people confuse geographic expansion with structural distribution. But expansion often produces the opposite effect. The larger the network becomes, the more movement concentrates through specific channels. And once enough dependency concentrates, the entire structure begins depending on continuity through very narrow points. At that stage, control itself becomes fragile. Because fragility is no longer distributed, it becomes concentrated too. This is why dominant systems often appear strongest shortly before disruption spreads through them. Because visible scale hides internal compression, the structure still appears massive, But internally, movement has already narrowed into critical paths that cannot absorb interruption anymore. And once those paths destabilize, the entire structure begins losing coherence. Not gradually, systemically, because bottlenecks transform local instability into structural instability. This is why large systems repeatedly reorganize around narrow corridors. Not because concentration is temporary, because concentration is unavoidable. Movement compresses, dependency compresses, control compresses, and eventually, entire systems begin depending on structures too narrow to remain stable for long. This is why control collapses into bottlenecks, because scale does not distribute dependency forever. It concentrates it, quietly, progressively, structurally, and once enough pressure accumulates inside those narrow paths, fragmentation begins.